If there was one thing that kept families alive during the Great Depression, it wasn't luck or money. It was the garden. When wages disappeared and food lines stretched for blocks, your grandparents turned to the soil for survival. Some vegetables grew faster, lasted longer, and filled bellies better than others. These were crops that thrived in poor soil, stored through winter, and kept families strong when nothing else could. Here are 50 victory crops that fed your grandparents during the Great Depression, starting with a highly underrated favorite. Okra. Back when the soil cracked from heat and wallets stayed empty, okra was the crop that kept dinner on the table. Its tall, sturdy stalk stood proud in every patch of dirt, producing pods that grew faster than weeds. The best thing about okra wasn't just how tough it was, it could do everything. Boiled, fried, stewed, or pickled, it found its way onto every plate, turning thin rations into real meals. They waited until the soil held real summer heat before planting, knowing that cold ground stopped okra dead. The seeds went into soft, dry soil, and the warmth alone brought them roaring to life. Each pod thickened soups and gumbo, adding weight where meat couldn't. It didn't care about bad soil or brutal heat, it just kept growing. Your grandparents loved it because one short row could feed a whole family for months. The leaves worked as cooking greens when nothing else was left, and the pods were dried and saved for seed at season's end. Even during droughts, okra didn't quit. It grew taller, survived storms, and kept putting food on the table long after other plants gave up. Early Jersey Wakefield cabbage. This variety of cabbage was a real hero when times were rough. Its tight, cone-shaped heads packed plenty of food into every inch of garden space, and it didn't mind the cold one bit. Cheap to grow, full of vitamins, and quick to mature, it became the go-to crop when every meal counted. Families planted it early, trusting it to survive cool springs and deliver before hunger hit hardest. It cooked fast, stored easily, and had a natural sweetness that made even simple meals better. Boiled with potatoes, tossed into soups, or shredded into slaw, it stretched food further than anyone thought possible. Your grandparents relied on it because it never failed. One small patch could feed the family for months. They set the young plants deep and packed the soil firm because loose earth made the heads split. Once settled, the roots clung tight and the cabbage swelled strong and sweet. It even pulled double duty since the outer leaves went to chickens or compost. And when turned into sauerkraut, it became the best kind of insurance, jars of vitamin-rich food that lasted all winter long. Golden wax beans. Golden wax beans glowed like treasure among green vines, shining bright even when times were dark. These beans thrived when other crops struggled, producing tender, buttery pods that filled baskets all summer long. Families planted them in small spaces, along fences or between rows of corn, where they returned more food than almost any other vegetable. Their flavor was mild and rich, perfect for boiling, frying, or canning. Your grandparents loved them for more than taste. They harvested the pods while still slim and buttery, because once they filled out, the vines stopped producing. Frequent picking kept the plants lively right through the season. They stored easily, held their color in jars, and fed families deep into winter. A single handful of seeds could grow enough to fill shelves with food for months. Dried beans from the same plants were saved for stews or replanted the next spring. They fixed nitrogen in the soil, leaving it healthier than before, and their quick harvest meant there was always something to eat. Henderson bush lima. The Henderson bush lima earned its place as one of the most dependable crops of the Depression era. It didn't need a trellis or rich soil, just a bit of patience and care. The plant stayed compact, easy to tend, and grew well even in dry, hot weather that ruined other vegetables. Families counted on them for their buttery flavor and filling texture, perfect for soups, stews, or casseroles when meals needed substance. They soaked the lima seeds overnight in warm water before planting, which softened the shells and sparked faster sprouting. By morning, the seeds were swollen and ready for sun. They were small but mighty, each pod packed with the kind of protein that kept strength up when meat was scarce. Your grandparents planted rows of these limas because they thrived where little else did, producing steady harvests from midsummer until frost. The beans dried well, filling jars that lined pantry shelves through winter. Even after months of storage, they cooked tender and rich, holding their flavor. Each plant gave more than expected, and that reliability made it a survival essential in every victory garden. The Oxheart Carrots. Oxheart carrots grew in rows of green tops, hiding their distinctive treasure beneath the soil. Unlike their slender cousins, these stout heart-shaped giants were dependable workhorses, easy to store, and rich in nutrients that kept families strong through the hardest years. Their chunky roots, often weighing up to a pound each, pushed successfully through heavy clay and poor soil where traditional varieties failed, breaking it up for future crops while feeding those who planted them. The bright orange flesh of these palm-sized beauties kept well in cellars or sand pits, staying crisp for months. Your grandparents prized Oxhearts for their sweet, mild flavor and impressive yield in challenging conditions. They ate them raw, stewed, or mashed with potatoes to stretch a meal, appreciating how a single Oxheart could feed twice as many mouths as conventional carrots. When sugar was rationed, Oxheart carrot pulp even sweetened desserts and breads with its naturally higher sugar content. Your grandparents loosened the soil deep before sowing, knowing heavy dirt twisted the roots. The fine ground let the carrots push straight down and swell wide without splitting. The tops went to animals or compost, ensuring nothing was wasted. Oxheart carrots, introduced to America in the 1880s, grew quietly, but always delivered a substantial harvest with minimal effort, a dependable heirloom root that appeared in victory gardens and family plots year after year. Pigeon peas. Pigeon peas were a hardy legume that grew tall and strong in the heat, providing both food and soil improvement. Their woody stems supported clusters of pods that held small, nutty-tasting peas. The plants resisted drought, stayed green through dry spells, and kept producing long after other crops quit. Families used them fresh in stews or dried them for soups and breads. Your grandparents planted pigeon peas for their double purpose. They pinched the tops off when plants reached knee height, which made them branch lower and produce more pods through the dry months. They fixed nitrogen to enrich soil and supplied food that lasted through storage. The bushes acted as windbreaks, protecting nearby vegetables from damage. The seeds boiled soft and rich, combining well with rice or cornmeal for balanced meals. Dried peas were stored in jars, where they kept good for years if kept dry. They required little care and produced heavily, often yielding more than one harvest in warm regions. The stems were tough enough for kindling, and the roots strengthened soil for the next crop. Potatoes. Potatoes were the solid foundation of every Depression-era garden, a crop so dependable that families planted them by the sack. They grew in barrels, boxes, or patches of soil behind sheds, yielding pounds of food from a few cut pieces. Each eye planted promised another meal down the line. Once mature, they could be dug, dried, and stored for months in a cool cellar, feeding families through winter without spoiling. Your grandparents relied on them because they filled plates cheaply and stayed good long after harvest. They kept piling soil around the green shoots as they grew, a trick called hilling, which protected the tubers from light and helped each plant form a larger crop. Every part found use, the skins for soups, the peels for feed, and the flesh for boiling, baking, or frying. Potatoes delivered vital nutrients like potassium and vitamin C when other foods were scarce. They cooked quickly, required almost no seasoning, and could stretch any meal. A single harvest could fill barrels, ensuring there was always something to eat when times turned hard. The sturdiness of potatoes made them the quiet workhorses of survival gardens everywhere. Dent corn. Dent corn was the kind families planted when survival came first. Each golden ear carried small dents in the kernels, the mark of drying starch that made it perfect for grinding into meal, grits, or cornbread. Unlike sweet corn, it wasn't for snacking, it was for storage, for feeding both people and animals through lean months. The plants grew tall and strong, even in poor soil, and needed little care once rooted. After harvest, families hung the ears to dry, the kernels hardening until ready for the grinder. Your grandparents used hand-cranked mills to turn it into cornmeal for bread, hot cakes, and thickening soups. They always planted corn in tight square patches instead of single rows, so the wind could carry pollen from stalk to stalk and fill every ear evenly. The stalks became fodder for livestock, and even the husks found use as bedding or fire kindling. Nothing was wasted. Its long shelf life meant food security in uncertain times, and a few rows behind the barn could yield enough for months of meals. Dent corn didn't just fill stomachs, it powered entire households with steady nourishment. Buckwheat. Buckwheat was one of the quickest and most forgiving crops your grandparents could grow when time and soil worked against them. It sprouted in poor, sandy ground and was ready to harvest in just 6 weeks. The plant needed little water, shaded weeds with its dense leaves, and brought pollinators to the garden with its tiny white flowers. The seeds were ground into flour for pancakes, bread, and porridge, making meals stretch when wheat ran short. Families planted it between main crops to keep the soil fertile and crumbly. They pressed the seed lightly into the surface rather than burying it deep, letting air and warmth reach it fast. Within days, green shoots covered the bare ground. Its roots loosened compacted earth, preparing the ground for vegetables that followed. Your grandparents saved the groats in sacks through winter, knowing a handful could feed a family for a day. The straw-fed livestock and the hulls were stuffed into pillows for soft bedding. It grew fast, cost almost nothing, and delivered both food and soil improvement in a single season. CiccoBroccoli. CiccoBroccoli was prized for its steady production of side shoots long after the main head was harvested. It grew quickly from seed, thriving in the mild weather of spring and fall. Families cooked it with onions, tossed it into soups, or steamed it plain when meals needed something green. Your grandparents planted this variety because it didn't quit. It kept sending up new stems, week after week. They cut the main head early, knowing the side shoots that followed would keep coming for weeks and taste even sweeter. Each harvest brought tender florets rich in vitamins and calcium. The stalks were sliced thin and cooked too, nothing wasted. It grew well in small plots and made excellent use of garden space. Even after a frost, the plants bounced back strong, giving one of the most dependable yields of any green vegetable. Millet. Millet was the grain that thrived where others failed, its small golden seeds filling both bowls and bellies through the hardest years. It handled drought, heat, and poor soil, growing steadily when rain refused to fall. Families used it as a cereal, cooked soft like porridge or ground into flour for bread and biscuits. Its short growing time meant 2 harvests a year in warmer areas, giving constant supply. Your grandparents planted millet because it matured quickly and stored safely for years when kept dry. They planted millet shallow in dry, sandy soil because it thrived where others wilted. A single rain was enough to wake it, and sun did the rest. Birds and livestock thrived on it too, making it doubly valuable. The stalks grew tall and dense, protecting the soil from erosion and shading out weeds. Once cut, the plants were tied into bundles and left to dry before threshing the seeds loose. The grains boiled fast and filled stomachs when food was scarce. It took little to grow, no irrigation, no fertilizer, yet it offered dependable food where other crops died out. Millet kept families and animals alive through seasons that tested every farmer's resolve. Spinach beet. Spinach beet, also known as perpetual spinach, was a leafy crop that kept gardens productive far longer than ordinary greens. The plants grew quickly, producing tender leaves that could be cut again and again through summer and fall. It looked like Swiss chard, but had a milder flavor and softer texture, ideal for soups and stir-fries. Families used it fresh, canned it for winter or blanched, and dried it for later cooking. Your grandparents planted spinach beet because it thrived in both heat and cool, needing little care and continuing to grow after repeated harvesting. They cut the outer leaves often and left the centers alone, so the plant kept pushing up new greens week after week without tiring. The stems stayed crisp while the leaves stayed sweet, making it a favorite for daily meals. Its deep roots drew nutrients from poor soil, and it rarely bolted, even in strong sun. The plants provided vitamins that kept families strong when fresh produce ran low. Once established, spinach beet lasted for months, giving fresh greens long after other vegetables had gone to seed. Rutabaga. Rutabagas were known as the poor man's potato, a sturdy, knobby root that filled stomachs when little else was available. They grew big, stored long, and resisted frost better than many vegetables. The yellow flesh cooked soft and mild, blending easily with potatoes or carrots in stews. Families boiled and mashed them or diced them into soups for a filling, slightly sweet flavor. Your grandparents prized rutabagas because they grew in almost any soil and produced heavy yields with little care. They waited for the first light frost before harvesting because the cold turned the starchy roots into sweet, buttery food fit for storage. The plants tolerated cold, so they were pulled late in the season when other crops had already been lost. Their thick skins kept them fresh through winter storage, and even after months in a cellar, they were still firm. Farmers also fed them to livestock, making rutabagas doubly useful. The greens at the top didn't go to waste either. They were boiled like collards, adding another source of food from the same plant. Red romaine lettuce. Red romaine lettuce brought color and crunch to depression gardens, a rare treat when diets leaned on roots and grains. Its burgundy-tinted leaves held up under heat better than other lettuces, giving gardeners longer harvests. It grew quickly from seed and regrew after cutting, providing multiple yields from the same plant. Families used it in salads, sandwiches, and simple suppers of bread and vinegar dressing. Your grandparents valued it for its reliability. It germinated fast and didn't demand rich soil. They tied the outer leaves loosely near harvest, letting the centers stay pale and crisp while the sun toughened the outer ones. Heads were harvested young for tender leaves or allowed to mature into full bunches for storage in cool sheds. Its strong flavor paired well with onions or radishes, making plain meals feel fresh again. Even when drought hit, red romaine produced enough to keep tables supplied with greens. The outer leaves fed chickens, and the cores were composted back into the earth to enrich next year's soil. Tomatoes. Tomatoes brought color and flavor to every survival garden, thriving even in rough soil and long heat. They grew fast, needed little attention, and offered both fresh eating and long-term storage through canning or drying. The vines sprawled over fences, their red fruit standing out bright against the green. Families used every part, ripe tomatoes for slicing, softer ones for sauces, and overripe fruit for soups and stews. Your grandparents depended on them to bring life to plain meals and add vitamins when other produce ran out. They buried the stems deep, covering several leaf nodes, so hidden roots would sprout along the buried stalk and feed the plant twice as well. They canned jars of sauce, paste, and juice, stacking shelves with bright red food for winter. A single seed packet could fill a yard with vines, producing hundreds of fruits. Cooked with onions and salt, they became a base for nearly every dish. The plants needed little more than sun, water, and space to sprawl, yet they gave back more than most crops could. White Creole onions. White Creole onions earned a special place in Depression-era gardens for their flavor and long storage life. Their crisp, white bulbs handled the southern heat better than most varieties, which made them a dependable kitchen staple. They grew easily from seed or sets, maturing into firm bulbs with sharp, clean flavor. Families braided them by their stems and hung them in cellars or pantries, where they stayed good for months. Your grandparents used them daily, slicing them into soups, gravies, and stews that stretched whatever ingredients they had left. They stopped watering as soon as the tops bent over because dry soil helped the bulbs cure firm and store longer through the winter. Fried onions flavored beans, potatoes, and cornbread when meat was missing. Nothing added life to plain food like onions browned in a pan. They traded them too, 3 onions for sewing needles or lamp oil when supplies ran low. White Creole onions thrived where little else did, their roots steady in dry, sandy soil. Even the tops were snipped young for flavor before the bulbs formed. Peppers. Peppers added heat and flavor to plates when every bite counted. They grew fast, handled warm weather, and kept producing until frost. Families planted both sweet and hot types, using every one in soups, pickles, and sauces. When dried, they hung like red ribbons from porches and kitchen walls, ready to crush into seasoning through winter. Your grandparents relied on peppers to bring life to plain rations. Just a few slices could turn potatoes or beans into something new. They pinched off the first blossoms that appeared, forcing the plant to build strength before setting its real fruit later in the season. They canned mild varieties and strung the spicy ones into garlands that brightened gray days. The plants grew easily in small plots or among taller crops, saving space while yielding plenty. Peppers dried quickly in the air, losing nothing in flavor or strength, and they returned each year from saved seeds. The oil from the skins flavored cooking fat, and even a single pod stretched across many meals. Swiss chard. Swiss chard, the poor man's spinach, was one of the easiest greens to grow and one of the hardest to exhaust. It thrived in nearly any soil, producing tender leaves for months after planting. Its colorful stems brightened dull gardens and brought fresh vitamins to the table. Families harvested it again and again, cutting the outer leaves while new ones grew back. Your grandparents planted it because it survived heat, frost, and neglect when other greens faded. They harvested the outer leaves only, letting the inner stalks keep growing and sending up new greens for months without tiring the plant. The leaves cooked quickly, wilted into soups, or sautéed with onions for simple dinners. Its mild flavor made it blend well with potatoes, beans, and rice, turning modest meals into filling food. Swiss chard could be dried or blanched and stored in jars for winter use. Even the stalks were cooked like celery, adding crunch to stews and casseroles. It was a steady, generous plant that asked for little but sunlight and water, and it gave back more than expected every season. Broad beans. Broad beans, also called fava beans, were among the first seeds to go into the soil each spring. They handled cold weather easily, sprouting while frost still clung to the ground. The plants grew tall and thick, producing long pods filled with meaty beans that cooked soft and rich. Families used them in soups, boiled them with salt and onions, or mashed them into spreads. They sowed the seeds early in cold soil because a bit of frost toughened the plants and brought stronger harvests once spring warmed. Your grandparents grew broad beans because they fixed nitrogen in the soil, improving it for the next crop, and because they yielded steadily even in rough ground. The beans were eaten fresh when young and dried for storage later in the season. The vines held strong through wind and cold, feeding families before summer gardens were ready. Each pod gave several seeds, and a single row supplied enough protein to replace meat. They stored well in jars, and the dried seeds sprouted easily for replanting. Broad beans were dependable, nutritious, and hardy, a crop that filled both pantry and soil with something valuable. Horseradish. Horseradish was the fiery root that brought heat to plain Depression meals. It grew from cuttings rather than seed, spreading fast and deep into the soil once established. The thick white roots were stored for months in cool cellars and kept their strength even after long winters. Families grated them into vinegar to make a pungent sauce that flavored meats, beans, and potatoes. Your grandparents kept horseradish patches along fence lines, where it needed no tending but returned year after year. They planted root cuttings on a slant instead of straight down, which made the roots grow longer and easier to dig out later. The leaves were large and sturdy, sometimes used to wrap pickles or cover crocks of fermenting vegetables. Digging the roots was hard work, but the result was worth it. A single plant yielded several thick roots for seasoning and trade. The sharp flavor stretched simple ingredients into full meals, making it a prized crop when spices were unaffordable. Once planted, horseradish stayed put, feeding families for decades. Sorrel. Sorrel was a leafy green with a sharp lemony taste that cut through heavy food. It appeared early in spring, one of the first fresh vegetables after winter scarcity. The plant grew quickly, thriving in partial shade and moist soil. Families added it to soups, mashed it into potatoes, or cooked it into sauces for fish or bread. Your grandparents planted sorrel because it came back every year with almost no care. They cut the young leaves often through summer because frequent picking kept the plant tender and stopped it from bolting in the heat. The leaves were tender when young and stayed edible long into summer if picked often. Sorrel's sour tang came from oxalic acid, which made it refreshing in warm weather meals. It was rich in vitamin C, a natural defense against sickness when fresh fruit was rare. The plants spread on their own, filling garden corners that would otherwise stay empty. Beets. Beets were one of the sweetest and most reliable roots in every Depression-era garden. They grew fast, stored well, and provided both food and nutrition when it mattered most. The dark red roots thrived in cool soil and could be harvested in under 2 months, making them a dependable source of vitamins and minerals. Families boiled, roasted, or pickled them to keep on pantry shelves through winter. They thinned the seedlings early, pulling the extras for greens, and left space between the rest so the roots could grow round and sweet. The greens were just as valuable, cooked like spinach, and rich in iron. Your grandparents planted rows of Detroit dark reds every year because they gave 2 crops in one, the root and the leaf. Sliced beets filled jars of vinegar brine, their color staining the kitchen like a badge of hard work. They didn't spoil easily, even in root cellars without refrigeration. A single patch could produce enough to fill a family's pantry, ensuring bright color and sweetness through long, cold months. Beets were easy to grow, easy to keep, and impossible to waste. Cowpeas. Cowpeas, also known as black-eyed peas, thrived under the hottest sun and poorest soil. Their vines spread low and fast, covering ground that other plants couldn't handle. The plants fixed nitrogen, improving the soil while providing pods heavy with edible peas. Families harvested them green for fresh eating or let them dry on the vine for long storage. Your grandparents planted cowpeas in the corners of fields and between rows of corn, using them to fill empty ground and protect the soil. They let the soil dry between waterings, knowing cowpeas thrived in heat and struggled in damp ground that softened the pods. The peas boiled soft and creamy, flavored with a pinch of salt or any scrap of bacon available. Their roots reached deep, pulling moisture from dry dirt and surviving drought when other crops failed. Dried peas stored easily in sacks and stayed good all winter. A single planting could yield enough to feed several households, making cowpeas one of the most reliable foods in tough conditions. Scarlet Ohno Turnip. The scarlet Ohno turnip stood out in dusty fields with its deep magenta skin and crisp white flesh. Fast-growing and easy to harvest, it matured in less than 2 months, which made it ideal for quick food when hunger pressed close. It grew well in cool weather and poor soil, filling baskets when other crops stalled. The roots had a mild, peppery flavor that softened when cooked, and the greens boiled down into nutrient-packed side dishes. Your grandparents grew these turnips because they gave both root and leaf, making them twice as valuable for the effort. They sprinkled a handful of wood ash between the rows, keeping the soil sweet and the flea beetles from chewing through the tender greens. They were sliced thin for salads, mashed with potatoes, or roasted in pans of lard for a simple, hearty meal. The plants didn't need much space, which made them perfect for backyard plots. The roots were stored easily in cellars or barrels of sand, staying crisp and fresh for weeks. Spinach. Spinach was one of the earliest crops to sprout when the cold soil started to warm. Its tender green leaves gave families a much-needed source of vitamins after long winters of dried food and root vegetables. It grew fast, stayed low to the ground, and produced continuously if picked right. Families used it in soups, casseroles, and stews, or simply wilted it in a pan with salt and fat. Your grandparents planted it between rows of slower crops, letting it fill empty ground and make use of every inch of soil. They planted spinach early in cool soil because once the heat arrived, the plants would bolt and the leaves would turn bitter fast. Spinach thrived in cooler temperatures and could even survive light frost, making it a steady source of fresh food early in the season. The iron and vitamin A it carried were crucial to keeping families healthy when meals lacked variety. The leaves dried quickly in the sun and could be stored in paper sacks for later cooking. Each handful carried strength, picked before the heat made it bolt. Winter squash. Winter squash earned its name from its staying power, the thick-skinned gourds that could rest for months without spoiling. Their vines sprawled across garden edges, soaking up sun and producing heavy fruit that ripened late in the season. The flesh cooked soft and sweet, perfect for soups, stews, and pies when sugar and fresh produce were scarce. Your grandparents stored them in root cellars or under porches where the cool air kept them firm through winter. Each squash was a meal in itself, roasted, mashed, or stuffed to stretch supplies. Even the seeds were roasted for snacks rich in fat and protein. They left a few inches of stem when cutting the fruit, since broken stems spoiled fast, while long ones kept the squash firm for months. The plants thrived in poor soil, their vines shading out weeds and keeping moisture locked in. Winter squash became a dependable autumn harvest, heavy enough to carry families through cold months when little else grew. Cushaw squash. Cushaw squash stood out for its size and strength, a long-necked, thick-skinned variety that fed entire families from just a few vines. Its pale green rind resisted rot and pests, while the golden flesh stayed sweet and firm for months in storage. It thrived in dry, poor soil where other crops failed, producing fruit that often weighed more than 20 pounds. The flesh was boiled, baked, or mashed into pies, and its mild flavor worked in both savory and sweet dishes. Your grandparents planted it for its endurance and yield. They let every fruit ripen fully on the vine before cutting, knowing early picking meant watery flesh that spoiled long before winter's end. One vine could feed a family for weeks. The seeds were dried and roasted for snacks or saved for next season's planting. The thick rind made it perfect for cellars, where it outlasted frost and humidity. Cooked with cornmeal and butter, it made hearty dinners that didn't need meat to satisfy. Even the hollow shells were used as livestock feed or compost for new soil. Sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes filled both gardens and bellies with their rich orange flesh and long-keeping nature. The vines spread fast, covering bare soil and protecting it from erosion while producing heavy yields underground. They were sweet, full of fiber, and high in vitamins that kept families strong through lean months. Your grandparents counted on them because they stored easily, lasting all winter in cool, dry spaces. They baked, boiled, or fried them, and even turned them into pies when sugar was scarce. They waited until the vines turned yellow before digging, giving the roots time to sweeten and toughen their skins for storage. The vines themselves could be eaten as greens, giving 2 harvests from one plant. Slips were saved each year from the best tubers and replanted, keeping the crop going without cost. In regions where other roots failed, sweet potatoes thrived in heat and sandy ground. They didn't spoil easily, which made them an ideal safety crop when hunger pressed close. Endive. Endive was one of the greens that carried families from summer into fall with steady harvests and crisp leaves. Its slightly bitter flavor paired well with vinegar or fat, cutting through the heaviness of potato and bean dishes. The plants grew best in cool weather, forming tight heads when blanched from sunlight. Families used the curly leaves fresh in salads or cooked them down like cabbage. Your grandparents grew endive because it matured fast and tolerated light frost, giving food when most greens had faded. They tied the leaves together as they grew, shading the hearts and giving the inner leaves their pale color and gentle taste. It didn't need rich soil, only moisture and occasional thinning. The leaves were blanched by tying them together, keeping the centers tender and pale. It provided vitamins and variety when gardens leaned heavily on root crops. The seeds were saved from the strongest plants, making it a self-sustaining crop for every season. Endive fit perfectly between rows of slower vegetables, growing quietly and quickly without stealing space. The plants held their flavor well, and a small patch could yield dozens of heads before the first frost. Navy beans. Navy beans were known as the poor man's meat for their steady protein and easy storage. They grew on compact bush plants that required little space, producing pods filled with small white beans. The beans cooked smooth and creamy, ideal for soups, stews, and baked dishes that stretched across several meals. Your grandparents planted navy beans because they stored for years without spoiling and required no special soil to grow. The vines fixed nitrogen, leaving the ground richer for future crops. Once harvested, the pods were dried on racks, then shelled and packed into cloth sacks. Your grandparents pulled the whole plants once the pods rattled dry, then hung them upside down to finish curing before shelling out the beans. A few handfuls could feed a family, and the dried beans cooked down into filling meals with only salt or onions added. They were reliable in any climate, thriving in heat and surviving periods of drought. Every part of the plant had use, the leaves as compost, the stems as kindling. Navy beans fed thousands of families because they delivered both nourishment and endurance in one small, simple crop. Cucumbers. Cucumbers grew quickly and produced more than most gardens could keep up with, making them a summer essential. Their climbing vines and broad leaves shaded the soil, keeping weeds down while producing crisp green fruit. Families ate them fresh or turned them into pickles to preserve for winter. The pickling process was simple: brine, vinegar, and patience. Your grandparents grew them along fences and trellises to save space and keep the fruit straight. They planted cucumbers along fences, letting the vines climb upward so the fruit grew straight and clean instead of curling in the dirt. They used crocks and jars to store pickles for months, each batch adding flavor to simple meals. The high water content made them refreshing during long days of outdoor work, and the vines kept producing even after heavy picking. Cucumbers thrived in the heat, and a single row could fill baskets every week. The seeds were dried on cloth for the next season, ensuring a constant supply without buying new ones. Radishes. Radishes were the fastest return a gardener could hope for, ready to harvest in as little as 3 weeks. Their peppery flavor cut through the blandness of daily meals and made salads, sandwiches, and stews come alive. They grew in almost any patch of soil, demanding little care and rewarding even beginner gardeners with steady yields. The round red roots and crisp white flesh stored well in cool, damp sand. Your grandparents planted them between slower crops like cabbage or beans to make the most of every inch of ground. They grew quickly, keeping the garden productive while other plants matured. The leaves were edible too, boiled or sautéed as greens. Families pickled them in vinegar for longer storage, keeping a bright, spicy flavor through winter. They planted radishes in freshly turned soil and pulled them as soon as the shoulders showed, because leaving them longer made the roots woody and harsh. They thrived in spring and fall, making them a year-round companion to other vegetables. Even when space was tight, a few handfuls of seed ensured fresh food within weeks, turning bare soil into nourishment almost overnight. Cauliflower. Cauliflower took a little more patience, but it paid off with hardy white heads that could stand in for meat on lean days. It thrived in cool weather and needed rich, moist soil to form dense curds. Families boiled it with potatoes, mashed it with butter, or cooked it in milk for a warm, creamy meal. Your grandparents grew it because it provided variety when gardens were filled with greens and roots. They folded the outer leaves over the white heads once they appeared, shielding them from the sun so the curds stayed bright and tender. Cauliflower was stored in cellars wrapped in leaves to keep it from drying out. The outer leaves were also used for soups and stews, ensuring nothing went to waste. Seeds were saved from the strongest plants, helping gardens stay self-sufficient. It took up little space but gave big rewards, offering both flavor and nutrition when fresh produce was scarce. Garlic. Garlic was a quiet but essential crop in every Depression-era garden. It needed almost no care, growing from single cloves tucked into the ground before winter. By midsummer, the bulbs were ready, compact, aromatic, and full of strength. Families used it to flavor soups, beans, and stews when spices were scarce, turning simple ingredients into something memorable. Your grandparents planted garlic in long rows beside onions and leeks, where its scent helped deter pests from other vegetables. They planted cloves in autumn and waited for the leaves to yellow in summer before pulling, giving the bulbs time to cure firm and full. Once pulled, it was tied into braids and hung from rafters to dry, keeping good for months without spoilage. The small bulbs were separated and the largest cloves saved for planting again. A few heads could last all year if stored in a cool, dry spot. It was crushed into salt, rubbed on meats, and boiled for medicinal tonics that many swore kept colds away. Garlic took little room, asked for nothing but patience, and rewarded every gardener with both flavor and remedy. Beans. Beans of all varieties were the backbone of Depression gardens, simple yet powerful in how much they provided. They grew fast, didn't need special soil, and offered one of the cheapest sources of protein available. Families grew both bush and pole varieties to make the most of limited space, climbing up poles and fences to double the yield. Each plant produced pods for fresh eating in summer and dry seeds for storing in winter. Your grandparents depended on them because a small patch could feed a family for months. They picked the pods while still soft because waiting too long hardened the seeds and made the plant quit producing new ones. Dried beans were strung up by wood stoves to cure, filling the house with their earthy scent. Once shelled, they went straight into jars or sacks, ready for the next cold day's stew. They improved the soil, too, leaving it richer for the next planting season. When meat disappeared from the table, beans stepped in without complaint. They simmered in pots beside onions, salt, and maybe a scrap of fat, turning into something filling and dependable every single time. Green arrow peas. Green arrow peas grew tall and strong, known for their long pods filled with rows of sweet, tender peas. They thrived in cool weather, climbing trellises and producing generous harvests early in the season. Families used them fresh in soups or boiled them with butter and salt for simple meals. When dried, they stored well and kept their sweetness through winter. Your grandparents planted them because they fixed nitrogen into the soil, improving next year's crops without fertilizer. Each plant gave 2 harvests, the first of tender young pods, the second of fully matured peas for drying. Grandpa kept the vines tied upright, letting air move through and keeping the pods clean and easy to pick even after morning dew. The vines grew fast and the pods ripened evenly, making picking easy. Dried peas filled jars and sacks, ready for soups and broths that lasted all winter. A few handfuls of seed could produce bushels of food in one season, making them one of the most valuable legumes in the garden. Lentils. Lentils were one of the most efficient crops for feeding families through the Depression. Their small seeds packed more protein than most vegetables and cooked quickly, saving fuel and time. The plants were hardy, growing in poor soil with minimal water, and produced steady yields of flat pods filled with tiny discs. They matured fast, allowing 2 plantings in good years. Families boiled them into soups, mixed them with rice, or mashed them into simple patties. Your grandparents grew lentils because they required almost no maintenance, yet delivered food that stored for years. They stopped watering once the pods turned brown, letting the plants dry in the field before threshing to keep the seeds firm and long-lasting. Once dried, the seeds stayed usable indefinitely in jars or cloth sacks. The roots helped rebuild the soil, adding nitrogen for future crops, so lentils often shared space with corn or cabbage. They didn't spoil, didn't attract pests easily, and provided dependable protein when meat was out of reach. Their nutty, mild flavor worked in almost any dish, making them a quiet staple of survival gardens everywhere. Kale. Kale earned its place as the cold weather king of Depression gardens, thriving when other crops gave up. Its deep green leaves held more vitamins than almost any vegetable, rich in calcium, iron, and vitamin C, which kept families healthy through lean seasons. It grew fast, handled poor soil, and bounced back after every harvest. The leaves could be eaten raw in salads, cooked in stews, or boiled with salt and fat for filling meals. Your grandparents relied on kale because it kept producing even after frost, its flavor growing sweeter in the cold. It was planted close to the house so it could be gathered easily, even in snow. The plants lasted all winter, feeding families when fields lay bare. They left the plants standing after frost because the cold turned the leaves sweeter and made them last far longer in the garden. Seeds from one harvest became next year's crop, ensuring a permanent supply without cost. The tender young leaves were used for soups and the older ones chopped for cooking. Kale was tough, steady, and generous, needing only water and sun. When gardens emptied of other greens, it stood tall and ready, bright and strong against frost. A few rows of kale meant fresh food long after the growing season ended, proof that hardiness always paid off. Cabbage. Cabbage filled depression gardens with thick green heads that stored for months and stretched into dozens of meals. It was easy to grow, resisted cold, and stayed edible long after harvest. Families boiled it with potatoes, fried it in bacon fat, or chopped it into soups. Its high vitamin C content kept sickness at bay when diets grew thin. Your grandparents planted cabbage in large patches because it asked for little care and gave more food per square foot than almost any other vegetable. Once harvested, the heads were stacked in cellars or covered in straw to keep through winter. The outer leaves fed livestock, and the trimmings went straight into compost for next season's soil. Families made sauerkraut by shredding and fermenting the leaves in crocks, a cheap way to preserve food without ice or jars. They twisted the heads slightly before cutting, loosening the roots just enough to slow new growth and keep the cabbage tight in storage. The plants thrived in cool weather, and with a short growing season, families often got 2 harvests a year. Cabbage took up little space, held firm through frost, and fed both people and animals. It turned empty gardens into dependable food stores and remained one of the most economical crops anyone could plant. Collard greens. Collard greens were the leafy staple that filled gardens in every southern household and far beyond. Their broad, dark leaves thrived in both heat and cold, growing strong even when soil was poor. The plants produced continuously, letting families pick from the same stalks for months. The flavor deepened after frost, turning sweeter in the cold. Your grandparents cooked collards low and slow, often with salt, onions, or a scrap of meat if there was any to spare. The greens were rich in calcium, iron, and vitamins that helped keep strength up when other vegetables ran out. Seeds were saved each year from the healthiest plants, making collards a permanent fixture in family gardens. Your grandparents harvested the lowest leaves first, leaving the center crown alone, so the plant kept sending up fresh growth through every season. Their deep roots improved the soil and resisted drought better than most leafy greens. They were eaten fresh in summer and blanched for winter storage, filling jars with a steady supply of food long after the fields froze. Chickpeas. Chickpeas, small but powerful, were prized for their high protein and hardy texture. They grew well in dry, thin soil that defeated other plants, making them dependable when water was scarce. The plants stayed low, spreading across the ground and resisting pests with their feathery leaves. Families boiled them into soups, mashed them into spreads, or roasted them for snacks. Your grandparents valued chickpeas because they kept for years when dried, feeding the household long after harvest. They waited for dry, steady heat before planting because chickpeas sprouted best in warm soil and too much moisture spoiled the seed before it grew. A single pound of seed could yield several times that amount in food. The crop returned nitrogen to the soil, helping other vegetables thrive in following seasons. Chickpeas required little attention, yet the returns were steady and rich in nutrition. Their nutty flavor and firmness gave weight to meals that lacked meat, and the ease of drying made them a mainstay in every home. Turnip greens. Turnip greens grew fast, thick, and reliable, producing food from both root and leaf. The plants sprouted easily from seed and thrived in cool, moist soil. Families harvested the greens young for tender leaves and left the roots to fatten underground. They cut the greens when still small and bright, knowing that tender young leaves brought better flavor and let the roots fatten quietly underneath. Cooked with salt and vinegar or stewed alongside beans, they gave warmth and flavor to plain meals. Your grandparents planted turnip greens because they grew quickly and filled gardens early in spring or late into fall. Even after repeated cuttings, the leaves returned strong, keeping the soil shaded and fertile. The roots stored well while the greens were dried or canned for later use. A single row could yield continuous food through most of the year. Turnip greens provided vitamins, minerals, and bulk to meals that otherwise lacked both variety and nutrition. Kohlrabi. Kohlrabi was one of the most unusual but valuable vegetables to appear in Depression gardens. Its pale, round bulbs grew above the soil, crisp and mild like the heart of a cabbage with a hint of sweetness. It thrived in cool weather, matured quickly, and didn't mind poor soil. Families sliced it raw into salads or boiled it with potatoes for filling meals. The greens on top were eaten like turnip leaves, doubling the harvest from a single plant. Your grandparents grew kohlrabi because it stayed firm after frost and stored well in root cellars. They harvested the bulbs while still no bigger than a fist because once they grew larger, the flesh turned tough and lost its sweetness. It didn't need much space, which made it perfect for small backyards. The thick skin kept the bulbs fresh for weeks, and every part of the plant could be used. Sautéed, mashed, or roasted, it worked in almost any dish and required little seasoning. Once planted, it needed only watering and weeding to give steady yields that lasted deep into winter. Parsnips. Parsnips were dependable roots that sweetened after the first frost, turning starch into sugar under the soil. They grew deep and strong, thriving in cold weather when other crops had died off. Their creamy white flesh added mild sweetness to soups, stews, and roasts, especially when paired with potatoes or carrots. Families left them in the ground through winter, digging them up as needed for fresh food. Your grandparents planted parsnips because they needed no special storage, keeping well right in the soil until spring. They left parsnips in the ground until after the first frost, which turned their starch into sugar and gave them a soft, nutty taste. They were rich in vitamins and calories, making them perfect for long, harsh winters. The tops went to livestock or compost, ensuring nothing went to waste. The roots held up to rough handling and never spoiled easily. They provided a steady supply of food that didn't cost extra effort, only patience and time. Celery. Celery was both a vegetable and a seasoning, grown for its crisp stalks and fragrant leaves. It needed cool, moist soil and regular watering, but once established, it yielded for months. Families used it in soups, stews, and salads, adding freshness to simple meals. The outer stalks were cooked while the inner hearts were eaten raw for their tender crunch. Your grandparents grew celery close to water sources or in shaded garden beds to keep it cool through the summer. They piled soil around the stalks as they grew, keeping sunlight out so the ribs stayed pale, crisp and mild instead of stringy. The leaves were dried and used as flavoring long after harvest, a thrifty substitute for expensive herbs. The stalks stored well when wrapped in damp cloth and packed into boxes of sand or soil. Celery added both nutrition and flavor where few foods could, proving its worth in kitchens that had to make do with what was available. Garden peas. Garden peas were a must-have in every Depression garden, known for their sweetness and early yield. The plants thrived in cool weather, climbing up poles or fences with delicate tendrils that produced rows of crisp green pods. Families picked them young for tender peas or let them mature for drying and storage. They cooked quickly, needing little more than butter or salt to turn into a full meal. Your grandparents planted garden peas at the start of spring, when few other crops could handle the cold. They planted peas as soon as the frost eased because early sowing brought tender pods before the summer heat made them bitter. They were simple to grow and didn't ask for rich soil, just steady moisture and support for their vines. The plants fixed nitrogen, making the earth better for future plantings. Each handful of seeds gave several pounds of food in a single season. Fresh peas filled plates early in the year, and dried ones stored easily in jars for the months that followed. The vines, once spent, were turned back into the soil as compost, returning what they had borrowed. Families depended on them for both nutrition and their ability to keep gardens productive from one season to the next. Leeks. Leeks brought both flavor and substance to Depression-era meals. Their long, pale stalks grew strong in cool weather and sandy soil, often surviving the first frosts without trouble. They were milder than onions and stretched the same dishes further. Families added them to stews, pies, and gravies for a hearty taste that made small portions feel like more. Your grandparents planted leeks in deep trenches, slowly mounding the soil around them to blanch the stems and keep them tender. They kept adding soil around the stalks as they lengthened, blanching them white and sweet while shielding them from the sun. Once harvested, they stayed fresh for weeks if stored upright in cool, damp sand. The tops were trimmed and dried for seasoning, while the roots returned to the garden as compost. Leeks grew slowly but required little care, rewarding patience with steady yields. Their subtle sweetness gave warmth to soups, and they grew alongside cabbage, potatoes, and carrots in mixed plots that used every inch of space efficiently. Herbs. Herbs played an important role when food was plain and seasoning was scarce. Families planted small patches of parsley, sage, thyme, and basil near the kitchen door for easy picking. These herbs grew well in poor soil and needed almost no water once established. They added depth to beans, soups, and vegetables, making modest meals taste richer. Your grandparents relied on them for more than flavor. They pinched off flower buds the moment they appeared, forcing the plants to send more oil to the leaves and deepen their flavor. Many herbs were used for home remedies when medicine was too costly. Leaves were dried and stored in paper packets or hung in bunches above the stove. Even mint grew wild along fences and ditches, providing both tea and relief for upset stomachs. Each herb had a purpose, from rosemary for meat to parsley for digestion. They made small gardens more useful and gave every meal the taste of care and thrift. Eggplant. Eggplant offered a surprising variety of uses in Depression gardens. The glossy purple fruit thrived in heat, handled dry conditions, and kept producing for weeks. Its spongy flesh absorbed flavor easily, turning into filling dishes that replaced meat when none was available. Families sliced and fried it, baked it in casseroles, or stewed it with tomatoes and onions. Your grandparents planted eggplant because it gave good yields with little effort and stored well if picked before frost. They pruned off the lowest leaves so air could move through the stems, keeping the plants dry and the fruits clean and glossy. The plants grew sturdy and resisted pests that damaged softer vegetables. When fully ripe, the fruits were peeled, sliced, and salted to draw out bitterness before cooking. Seeds were dried and saved for next year's crop, making eggplant a lasting addition to gardens that valued self-reliance. Banana melon. Banana melon brought sweetness to gardens that mostly grew starches and greens. Its long yellow fruit looked like a banana, but tasted like a mix of cantaloupe and honeydew. The vines spread fast and wide, producing several large melons per plant, even in poor soil. Families treasured them because they could be stored for weeks without spoiling, a rare trait for fruit during the Depression. The fragrant flesh was eaten fresh, chilled in water, or sliced for desserts when sugar was scarce. Your grandparents planted banana melons because they thrived in dry heat and gave high yields with minimal watering. They turned each melon once as it ripened, letting both sides color evenly and stopping damp soil from spotting the skin. They used the fruit's aroma to perfume kitchens and cellars where fresh scents were scarce. The rinds were fed to animals, while seeds were rinsed, dried, and kept for the next season. Their firm texture made them ideal for preserves and jams that kept sweetness in reach all year. Which of these crops do you find the most dependable? Let us know in the comments below. If you learned something new today, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.